Hey guys, tonight we begin not with a philosopher or a conqueror, but with a few accidents of fate so bizarre that even the medieval church had to pause and say, okay, that's weird. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's hazy little journey together. The year was 1145, when England was still figuring out how shoes worked, and everyone was named either William, Henry, or something that sounded like a sneeze. In the city of Winchester, two noble families celebrated the birth of baby boys, both named William. Because apparently, originality was a sin back then. These weren't just any Williams. They were mirror images of each other. Born within weeks, raised in the same town, trained by the same swordmaster, and, according to one monk, even baptized with the same slightly stolen holy water. Their families were proud, though it's unclear whether they were proud of their sons, or simply proud of remembering which William was theirs at dinner. As adults, the Williams remained eerily similar. Same shoulder-length haircut, the medieval default, same scar on the left cheek, from the same jousting accident, because coordination wasn't genetic, and the same wife's name, Alice. Because back then, even romance lacked creativity. The monks chronicling all this insisted it was a sign from God, which is what medieval people called anything that made them uncomfortable, but too lazy to explain. One bright spring morning, both Williams went hunting, in different forests, at the exact same hour. Each spotted a deer, lowered his lance, charged forward, and immediately impaled himself on it. Same wound, same position, same day. It's hard to know what's more impressive, the odds or the sheer athleticism required to lose to your own weapon. The news hit Winchester like divine slapstick. 2 funerals were held in the same church, both led by priests named Thomas, both attended by widows named Alice, both of whom fainted at the same verse of the same hymn. Chroniclers didn't know whether to call it tragic or efficient. The bishop declared it proof that God's hand moves in mysterious ways. Sure, mysterious, or just slightly sarcastic. The locals started calling them the Twin Williams, though the idiot brothers who invented Darwinism might have been more accurate. To this day, historians can't explain how it happened, but personally I suspect divine boredom. Because if you were God in 1145, watching endless peasants farm turnips, you'd probably spice things up too. It was the year 1170, and Canterbury Cathedral was the kind of place where miracles, politics, and gossip shared the same pew. Monks were chanting, candles were flickering, and somewhere deep inside, fate was clearing its throat. During evening vespers, as the choir sang their usual hymn, something in the key of eternal suffering, one monk suddenly froze mid-verse. His name, according to the chronicles, was Brother Edmund, though given medieval spelling, it might have been Edmund, Edmond, or just Guy who panicked during prayer. Without warning, Edmund whispered, "He is dead." Everyone stopped singing, which, in a medieval monastery, was basically a war crime. The prior glared at him like he'd just questioned the Virgin Mary's cooking. "Who?" someone asked. And Edmund, apparently now the spokesman for the supernatural, replied, "Our Archbishop." Minutes later, a messenger burst through the cathedral doors, out of breath and covered in horse sweat, shouting that Thomas Becket, Archbishop of Canterbury, had just been murdered by King Henry's knights. Inside the same cathedral, the monks went pale. They had literally been singing in the choir while their boss was getting stabbed in the next room. Medieval acoustics were impressive, but not that impressive. Brother Edmund's prediction became an instant sensation. The monks called it divine revelation. The church called it evidence of holy favour. Everyone else quietly wondered if Edmund just had very thin walls and excellent hearing. Still, the story spread across England. Pilgrims flocked to Canterbury to see where, the monk who heard death once stood. Artists painted him with a golden halo. Ballads were written. And of course the church built a shrine, because nothing says mourning like selling tickets to it. Years later, another monk swore he heard voices before a fire broke out in the cathedral. By then, the abbot had a rule. No more holy predictions during Vespers. They were bad for morale and insurance rates. Modern historians argue it was coincidence, a chilling, perfectly timed coincidence. But personally, I think Brother Edmund just had one of those sixth senses all introverts possess. The ability to detect when something truly awkward is about to happen. And in medieval England, that was basically every day. Italy, 1350. The Renaissance was still warming up, and most artists were busy painting saints who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. But in the city of Modena, one painter stood out. Tommaso di Modena, a man so talented, so ahead of his time, that he accidentally invented prophetic art. A full century before the Black Death wiped out half of Europe, Tommaso painted a mural of monks wearing strange bird-beaked masks. At the time, nobody questioned it. Artists back then could paint an angel wrestling a fish, and people would just nod respectfully. But 100 years later, when the plague arrived, doctors began wearing the exact same masks. Long-nosed, hollow-eyed, nightmare fuel with straps. A look Tommaso had already plastered across a church wall. Modern historians say it's coincidence. Medieval people said it was sorcery. Personally, I think Tommaso just had one of those unsettling talents for predicting misery. You know, the kind of guy who paints a boat right before a flood and says, "I don't know, I just felt like it." Back then, plague doctors stuffed herbs and vinegar-soaked sponges into those masks, believing they filtered out the disease. In reality, it just made them smell slightly better while dying. Tommaso's mural, however, looked almost identical, even down to the herbs tucked in the beak. When people noticed the resemblance a century later, panic ensued. Pilgrims came from all over Italy to stare at the painting, convinced it was a divine warning. The church called it a miracle. The local priests called it deeply unsettling, especially since the mural was located right next to the cloister dining hall. For a while, Tommaso's painting was treated like a holy artifact. Monks prayed to it, villagers left offerings, and one abbot swore the eyes of the masked monks moved slightly every full moon. Spoiler, they didn't. The candlelight just flickered. But medieval people never let physics ruin a good haunting. Sadly, Tommaso died before he could paint any follow-ups. Probably for the best. The last thing Europe needed was a fresco of people coughing blood, and a title like Work in Progress. Centuries later, art historians still debate it. Visionary? Coincidence? Or just a man who accidentally painted history's creepiest trailer for the apocalypse? Whatever the truth, Tommaso di Modena remains the only artist whose work went viral 100 years after release. The year was 1346, and Europe was once again holding its favourite recurring event, the 100 Years' War. Somewhere in the chaos, King John of Bohemia decided that being blind shouldn't stop him from fighting. Because in medieval times there was no concept of bad idea, only hold my chalice. John had lost his sight years earlier due to disease, but that didn't stop him from insisting on leading his troops into the Battle of Crécy. His knights tried to talk him out of it, probably with sentences like, "Sire, you can't see the enemy," to which John allegedly replied, "Neither can they once I'm done." It was a great speech, right up until he tied his horse to his knight's reins and ordered them to charge. You can picture it. 5 horses galloping into the fog of battle, tied together like the world's deadliest friendship bracelet. Chroniclers say they fought bravely. Personally, I think they just couldn't stop. When the dust settled, the entire squad was found dead, still tied together, looking like a medieval cautionary tale titled, "Why Helmets Aren't Everything." For most people, that would have been enough of a lesson. But no. 200 years later, history apparently decided it liked the bit too much to let it go. In 1546, at the same battlefield, another nobleman, a French commander named Charles de Montpensier, also partially blind, also in denial, repeated the stunt, Same field, same idea, same result. His last words were reportedly, "for glory," which is a noble way of saying, "this will not end well." To be fair, medieval commanders had a gift for turning recklessness into legend. It's why half of Europe's coats of arms feature lions, eagles, or something on fire. Still, two blind men charging into the same battle, centuries apart, feels less like destiny and more like a cosmic rerun. The chroniclers framed both deaths as noble. They called it chivalric courage. Everyone else quietly called it natural selection with extra steps. And so, King John's legacy became a medieval proverb. Follow your dreams. But maybe untie the horse first. Because nothing says heroic quite like being remembered for the same mistake. Twice. It was the year 1231, a peaceful summer in the Rhineland, which in medieval terms meant only one minor plague and a tolerable amount of heresy. In a small Benedictine abbey near Trier, a group of monks decided to celebrate their good fortune by writing a new manuscript. It was an illuminated text titled On the Protection of Holy Houses. The title alone already tempted fate. The manuscript was ornate, detailed, and, in the opinion of everyone involved, an absolute masterpiece. It contained prayers for divine protection against fire, flood, rats, and the occasional Viking. The abbot was so proud he insisted they add one more line to the final page, a flourish of holy confidence that read, "This library shall never burn, for it is blessed by the hand of God." If you just winced reading that, congratulations. You're smarter than the entire 13th century. 3 weeks later, lightning struck the abbey. Twice. The entire complex went up like a tinderbox soaked in faith. The monks managed to save very little, though witnesses noted one odd detail. When the smoke cleared, a single parchment remained intact, the very page that boasted divine fireproofing. The survivors called it a miracle. Personally, I'd call it divine sarcasm. For years afterward, the story spread through the monasteries of Europe as a cautionary tale. Never brag in ink, they'd say, for God is reading. Of course, this didn't stop anyone. Monks continued writing absurd claims in manuscripts for centuries. This book cannot be lost. These words are eternal. Brother Anselm definitely didn't steal my quills. Spoiler, all of those manuscripts burned too. The Church officially classified the incident as Mysterium Fidei, a mystery of faith, which is medieval Latin for "we have no idea, but let's not talk about it." Local peasants, on the other hand, were far less diplomatic. They called it God's practical joke. Ironically, a later copy of the same manuscript, carefully rewritten by surviving monks, also vanished in a fire 40 years later. At that point, even heaven seemed committed to the bit. So the moral, if there is one. In medieval Europe, never tempt the Almighty with confidence, especially not in writing. Because if there's one thing history proves, it's that divine retribution has excellent comedic timing. If there's one thing medieval Scandinavia was good at, it was dying dramatically. And nobody did it quite like King Olaf of Norway. Well, except for another King Olaf of Norway, who apparently thought dying the same way in the same valley 2 centuries later was good brand consistency. Let's start with Olaf I, the year 1030, the Battle of Stiklestad. Olaf was already famous for trying to convert Vikings to Christianity, which, as jobs go, was like trying to sell salad at a meat festival. His subjects revolted, obviously. During the fight, someone loosed an arrow that struck him directly in the throat. He died instantly, holy, heroic, and probably regretting the lack of a helmet neck guard. Fast forward about 200 years, and Norway's PR department must have run out of new material. Along comes Olaf IV, another king with ambition, faith, and apparently no awareness of history. He rides into the same valley, same battle, same date on the calendar, and you guessed it, takes an arrow to the throat. You almost have to respect the dedication to symmetry. The chroniclers went wild. They called it divine mystery, a heavenly sign. Others noted that the second Olaf had chosen to fight in the exact same location as his ancestor, which feels less like destiny and more like poor decision-making. Historians later discovered that his advisors warned him about the omen, which he ignored, claiming God decides the hour of every king's death. Apparently that hour was right about now. Afterwards, locals swore that the earth where both Olafs fell turned red, stained with royal blood, they said. Modern geologists later confirmed it was just iron-rich soil, but in the 1200s people didn't do science. They did superstition, and superstition paid better. Pilgrims started visiting the site to see the soil that bled, though it's unclear what they expected it to do. Wave? In the end, both Olafs were declared saints, because when your monarchy keeps dying the same way, you might as well market it. 2 kings, 2 arrows, 1 very sarcastic universe. It's almost as if the Norse gods, still salty about being replaced, decided to run the same practical joke twice, just to prove they still had good aim. Of all the things the medieval church excelled at, crusades, corruption, and complaining about astrology. Digging up dead popes was not supposed to be one of them. But leave it to Pope Stephen VI, circa 897 AD, to look at a corpse and think, you know what this needs? A trial. Here's the setup. Stephen hated his predecessor, Pope Formosus, with the kind of passion usually reserved for medieval in-laws. So he ordered Formosus's body exhumed, 9 months dead, barely holding it together, dressed it in papal robes, and propped it on a throne in front of a council. The cadaver synod, as historians now call it, was exactly as unhinged as it sounds. Stephen screamed accusations of blasphemy at the corpse. A deacon was appointed to defend Formosus, which might be history's worst job description. The body was found guilty, shocker, stripped of its robes and tossed into the Tiber River. Even for the 9th century, that was considered a bit much. But then came the strange part. Months later, Rome flooded. The river carried Formosus's bloated body right back into the city, perfectly preserved, and deposited it on the steps of St. Peter's Basilica. Locals called it a miracle. Stephen called it a problem. Not long after, Stephen went insane, or, as the Vatican politely put it, displayed excessive zeal. He was imprisoned by his own clergy and strangled in his cell. Coincidence? Maybe. But it didn't stop there. Fast forward about 200 years, and another pope, also named Stephen, died on the exact same day of the same month, while giving a sermon warning against repeating the sins of Pope Stephen. Divine irony doesn't get more punctual than that. Historians call it the curse of the cadaver synod. Personally, I call it heaven's version of a bad Yelp review. After that, Rome quietly agreed never to put another corpse on trial again, because even medieval Europe, land of relics and holy toenails, had limits. The lesson? Never dig up your predecessor just to prove a point. It turns out, in Rome, bad ideas don't die. They just come back 9 months later, waterlogged and smelling like divine revenge. In the summer of 1212, Europe collectively lost its mind, again, and decided to send children to reclaim the Holy Land. The logic went something like this. If hardened soldiers can't capture Jerusalem, maybe a bunch of unsupervised 12-year-olds can. It was an idea so breathtakingly stupid that only the Middle Ages could pull it off with a straight face. Led by a French shepherd boy named Stephen of Cloyes and a German kid named Nicholas, thousands of children claimed to have visions of angels telling them to march to the sea, where God himself would part the waters. Instead, they reached the Mediterranean, stared at it for a while, and realized it was, in fact, still a sea. That was the high point. Some turned back. Others boarded ships, generously provided by merchants who promised safe passage. Spoiler. Those ships went straight to North Africa, where the kids were sold into slavery. The lucky ones made it home, older, wiser, and probably allergic to religious enthusiasm. The unlucky ones became a cautionary hymn. Fast forward 2 centuries, and Europe, apparently running low on creativity, decided to do it again. Another group of children, also claiming divine visions, set out along a nearly identical route. Same holy destination, same naive optimism, same lack of adult supervision. Predictably, they vanished too. Historians still argue whether it really happened twice, or whether medieval chroniclers got confused, which, considering their record-keeping, is entirely possible. Wait, are we still on the First Crusade? But what's undeniable is that the Children's Crusade became one of those stories Europe couldn't stop repeating. Part miracle, part mass delusion, and part tragic comedy. The Church, of course, insisted the children were inspired by faith. Everyone else suspected mass heat stroke. The weather that year was record hot, the roads swarmed with bandits, and apparently not one adult along the way stopped to ask, "Hey, should we maybe not let the orphans walk to Jerusalem?" If this story has a moral, it's that divine inspiration should always come with a chaperone. 2 crusades, 2 generations, 1 painfully avoidable mistake. And if history really does repeat itself, somewhere out there is a kid planning the 3rd one, probably with a GPORO. Some families pass down heirlooms. Others pass down land, titles, or shiny swords. But in the 13th century England, the Cliffords seemed determined to pass down only one thing: bad decision-making. Their story reads less like a noble lineage, and more like a cautionary comedy about hereditary stupidity. The first star of this tragic dynasty was Sir Walter de Clifford, who in 1203 managed to get himself accused of murder. The records don't say what happened, but given the era, it probably involved ale, horses, and someone getting insulted over whose saint was holier. When the royal guards came to arrest him, Walter panicked, fled town, and disappeared into legend, or at least into Wales, which in the 13th century was basically the same thing. Half a century later, history, and apparently God's sense of humour, repeated itself. Another Walter de Clifford, the grandson of the first, was accused of, you guessed it, murder. Same date, same town, same tavern, according to one suspiciously amused chronicler. When the sheriff showed up, this new Walter also bolted. The court notes simply say, fled and presumed guilty. At that point, even the scribes were rolling their eyes. You'd think someone in the family would have taken the hint, maybe changed the name, maybe stopped hanging around taverns on that specific day. But no. A century later, another Clifford, same name, same hairline of regret, was caught duelling a bishop's nephew, and once again vanished into the Welsh hills. Historians suspect the Cliffords weren't cursed, they were just consistently bad at hiding bodies. By the 1400s, doing a Clifford became local slang for running away from your own trial, which is saying something, because medieval England had a lot of things to run from. The family did eventually produce one success story, a Walter who actually made it to old age without committing homicide. Unfortunately, he died falling off his horse during a parade. No one was surprised. The chroniclers called the Cliffords an unfortunate lineage. Personally, I'd call them the Middle Ages answer to Darwin's theory. 3 centuries early, and 3 IQ points short. Some families leave behind castles. The Cliffords left behind a punchline. If there's one thing medieval Europe loved more than religion, it was fighting about it. And nowhere did theological debate get quite as flammable as Montségur, a fortress perched high in the Pyrenees and home to the Cathars, a group of monks who believed in peace, humility, and, unfortunately, living in a location that annoyed the Pope. By 1244, the Catholic Church had decided that peaceful heretics was an oxymoron. So, in a stunning display of Christian charity, they sent in an army. The siege lasted 10 months, during which both sides starved, froze, and loudly insisted that God was on their side. The Cathars claimed they didn't fear death, which, as it turned out, was convenient. When the fortress finally fell, about 200 monks were given a choice: convert to Catholicism or burn alive. They thought about it and said, "We'll burn, thanks." Always nice when medieval theology doubles as a barbecue. Chroniclers claimed that as the monks were consumed by flames, the fire formed a perfect cross against the night sky. The crowd gasped. The inquisitors called it a sign from heaven. Personally, I think it was just a windy night. Here's where it gets strange. Exactly 100 years later, another fire broke out in the same valley. Same date, same spot, same oddly cross-shaped flames. Locals panicked. "The spirits of the Cathars are returning," cried some. "Our firewood was arranged poorly," cried others. Either way, no one rebuilt anything there for decades. Pilgrims began visiting the site, claiming to feel holy heat rising from the ground. Merchants sold sacred ashes that were, in all likelihood, just dirt with branding. Even the church got nervous. Always awkward when your own miracle looks like divine trolling. To this day, historians can't explain the second fire. Lightning, freak weather, divine symbolism. Take your pick. But what's clear is that Montségur became the medieval version of a cursed franchise. The sequel nobody asked for, but everyone watched burn. The moral? Never taunt fate with martyrdom. It apparently has an excellent memory and a passion for reruns. 2 centuries, 2 infernos, 1 very judgmental sky. If heaven really did send a message that night, it was probably this: you people have learned absolutely nothing. In 1356, London was doing what London always did best: smelling bad, overtaxing everyone, and pretending God liked the English more than the French. It was a damp spring evening at Westminster Abbey, and the monks were deep in their usual routine, chanting, repenting, and hoping no one noticed how much wine had vanished from the sacramental stockroom. That's when the ravens came. A whole flock of them, black, loud, and, according to one chronicler, unusually judgmental. They circled the towers, cawing in unison like a feathered jury. The monks froze. Birds in the abbey meant omens, and omens meant someone important was about to have a terrible week. One monk nervously joked, "Maybe they've just come for crumbs." The others didn't laugh. In medieval Europe, everything was a sign from heaven, especially if it scared you. That night, a storm hit. Thunder shook the abbey, lightning split the sky, and every raven vanished at once, which, to a monk's imagination, was basically the medieval version of jump-scare cinema. The next morning, a messenger arrived from Windsor. Prince Edward, the heir to the throne, was dead. The monks promptly fainted, prayed, and began recording what they now called the Prophecy of the Ravens. Word spread fast. Pilgrims flocked to Westminster to see where God's birds of warning had appeared. Painters even depicted them with glowing eyes, because subtlety wasn't a thing in the 14th century. The ravens were said to have returned every few decades, always before tragedy, plague, famine, or the latest royal scandal. 2 generations later, the same thing happened again. Ravens, storm, tragedy. This time it was Edward III's grandson dying suddenly. The monks didn't even wait for confirmation. They started fasting on the spot. The birds had clearly developed a flair for timing. By the 17th century, superstition turned into policy. King Charles II, terrified of losing both throne and luck, issued an official royal decree: let there always be ravens at the Tower of London. To this day they're still there, fed, pampered, and slightly smug. Historians call it tradition. I call it medieval emotional support animals. And somewhere in the heavens, a flock of ravens is still cackling, knowing that one bad day in 1356 earned them lifetime job security. Historians love to say that history repeats itself, but they usually mean metaphorically. In 1166, England decided to take that concept literally and restage one of its greatest hits, the Battle of Hastings, now with extra déjà vu. It had been exactly 100 years since William the Conqueror's famous victory in 1066, where an arrow found King Harold's eye and half of England found new landlords named de something. A century later, local lords in Sussex apparently thought, you know what would be fun? doing that again. And thus began the most unnecessary sequel in medieval history. The players, descendants of the original Norman invaders and the surviving Saxon families who still hadn't let it go. Both sides even brought leaders named, wait for it, William, because England, in its proud tradition of name recycling, simply couldn't resist. The fight started over a land dispute, which is medieval code for someone's sheep wandered into the wrong meadow. What began as an argument over a fence post somehow escalated into a full-scale armed conflict, because this was the Middle Ages, and that's how property law worked. According to the Chronica de Sussexia, the battle took place on the very same hill where the Norman duke had triumphed. Both sides clashed with a level of enthusiasm unmatched since the last time England forgot how to share. And then, the truly bizarre happened. One of the Williams, a Saxon descendant, was struck in the eye by an arrow. Same wound, same hill, same name, same collective groan from the heavens. Chroniclers were beside themselves. "A miracle!" cried some. "A sign!" shouted others. "Maybe we should stop standing here," said absolutely no one. The church claimed the coincidence proved divine will still favoured the Normans. The locals, meanwhile, just started avoiding the place altogether. Farmers refused to plough it, travellers refused to camp on it, and one particularly nervous monk wrote that the ground remembers. Centuries later, historians dubbed it the Second Battle of Hastings, less famous than the first, but twice as ironic. 2 Williams, 2 arrows, 1 cursed hill. If time travel ever gets invented, that hill is absolutely off limits, because clearly even the 12th century had its copy-paste glitch. If you're looking for a saint who didn't take martyrdom too seriously, look no further than St. Lawrence, the patron saint of cooks, comedians, and people who die ironically. His story began in Rome, 258 AD, but his sense of humour aged perfectly into the medieval world, mostly because his death set an impossible standard for divine irony. When Emperor Valerian ordered the persecution of Christians, Lawrence, a deacon known for distributing alms, was arrested and told to hand over the church's treasures. Instead of producing gold, he brought a group of beggars and said, "Here are our treasures." Ancient sarcasm, the most dangerous kind. Naturally, the Romans sentenced him to death, but here's where Lawrence truly earned his halo. Instead of a quick beheading, they decided to roast him alive on an iron grill. As the fire blazed beneath him, witnesses claimed he called out, "Turn me over, I'm done on this side." Even in agony, the man was workshopping material. Some say he added, "You may eat now," though that might have been medieval fan fiction. The legend spread fast. Monks across Europe adored him, a saint who cracked jokes while literally on fire. It was the kind of dark humour only the Middle Ages could fully appreciate. Cathedrals were dedicated in his name, relics collected, feast days established. And, in a move that feels suspiciously deliberate, countless monasteries built their kitchens next to chapels of St. Lawrence. Because apparently nothing says divine protection like a patron saint who died as dinner, but fate wasn't done laughing. In the 11th century, a monastery in Spain named after St. Lawrence burned to the ground. Everything except the kitchen. The abbot declared it a miracle. The cook declared it predictable. A few decades later, another abbey in Normandy suffered the same fate. Chapel gone, kitchen intact. One monk wrote that St. Lawrence protects his own domain. Another replied, then maybe he could expand his jurisdiction. The church, naturally, called these coincidences signs of divine favour. Personally, I call them cosmic punchlines. St. Lawrence proved one eternal truth. Even in martyrdom, timing is everything. Because if you're going to die for your faith, you might as well make God laugh while doing it. The year was 1313, which already sounds suspicious. The kind of date that feels like it was made to host bad omens. In a chilly scriptorium somewhere in York, a monk named Brother Reginald sat hunched over parchment, quill in hand, and absolutely full of himself. He was writing what he called the mirror of the world, a prophetic text claiming to reveal divine patterns in history. The kind of thing you write when you're sleep-deprived and overconfident in your Latin. Toward the end of his manuscript, he scribbled a line that would make him famous centuries later. "When two kings share one name and one fate, the world shall tremble and the age shall end dramatic." Yes, accurate. Unfortunately also yes. Reginald died soon after writing it, which is pretty on brand for prophets. His manuscript sat forgotten for nearly 300 years, gathering dust and irony in equal measure. Then, in the 1500s, the prophecy suddenly made a terrifying comeback. Two monarchs, Henry II of France and Henry VIII of England, ruled their respective kingdoms at roughly the same time, both obsessed with power, vanity, and questionable relationship decisions. They were, in many ways, the medieval equivalent of two men racing to out-self-destruct. In 1559, King Henry of France entered a jousting tournament to show off his chivalric vigour. It ended with a lance splinter through his eye. A decade earlier, Henry VIII had died from a festering leg wound caused by, wait for it, a jousting accident. Two Henrys, two kings, two absurdly similar demises. One prophecy that aged a little too well. When scholars rediscovered Brother Reginald's manuscript, panic spread faster than the plague. Pamphlets were printed, preachers ranted, and peasants started checking their calendars for world-ending vibes. The church condemned the text as coincidental blasphemy, which is medieval for "we can't explain this, and it's making us uncomfortable." Of course, the world didn't end, unless you count the rise of Protestantism, several wars, and the death of jousting as a respectable hobby. The mirror prophecy became one of the Middle Ages' most famous coincidences. Two kings, same name, same wound, same stupid hat. If God does have a scriptwriter, this was the episode where they really leaned into the symbolism. Some people dream of dying peacefully in their sleep. Others hope to go out heroically in battle. But in 1199, one monk named Brother Aelred managed to die the way few men ever do, in a fit of laughter. And somehow, it made perfect sense for a man who'd spent his entire life mocking death. Brother Aelred was no ordinary monk. Before taking vows, he had been a jester in the court of a minor English noble, a man paid to make drunk aristocrats snort ale through their noses. But somewhere between the endless banquets and the occasional food fight, Aelred decided to repent. He joined a monastery, traded bells for robes, and became a surprisingly good preacher, if your idea of holiness included punchlines. The other monks loved him, most of the time. His sermons had names like God's Patience and the Abbot's Lack of It. He once carved a smiling face on the refectory door and called it Saint Optimus. When asked why he laughed so much, he reportedly said, "Because the devil hates joy, and I love annoying him." Naturally, this didn't sit well with the abbot, who warned Aelred that laughter leads to sin. Aelred replied, "Then hell must be a very boring place." Somewhere, an angel probably face-palmed. One stormy night, lightning struck the abbey's bell tower. The stone cracked, the roof shook, and a statue of St. Felix the Cheerful, which Aelred himself had commissioned, toppled from its niche. The heavy stone figure landed right on him, killing him instantly. Witnesses said he was laughing at the time, having just told a joke about divine timing. The chronicler's entry reads, "Brother Aelred met his end in laughter, as foretold by his own jest." The abbot called it a warning. The younger monks called it poetic. Personally, I call it a stand-up set with perfect comedic structure. Set-up, irony, punchline. In death, Aelred became an unofficial saint among novices, the patron of joy, bad timing, and people who just can't keep a straight face during prayer. His epitaph, according to rumour, simply read, "He laughed. God laughed louder." If medieval Europe ever had a sense of humour, it died with Brother Aelred, and probably chuckled all the way to heaven. In the harsh, sun-baked highlands of Lusitania, a young shepherd named Viriatus watched over his flock with more patience than most generals ever had for their men. The land was unforgiving, rocky slopes, thin soil, and predators that circled the herds by night. But it was there, among the wolves and the wind, that Viriatus learned endurance. Each day was a battle between man, beast, and hunger. And in those hills, the Romans were just another kind of predator. Rome saw the Iberian tribes as barbarians, wild, untamed, and conveniently taxable. To them, shepherds like Viriatus were beneath notice, unless tribute was due or rebellion brewing. They came demanding grain, gold, and men for their legions. But the Lusitanians were not easily bent. When the tax collectors came again, this time backed by steel, the shepherds picked up their crooks and turned them into spears. Viriatus fought his first skirmish not as a soldier, but as a man defending his home. The Romans expected quick submission. Instead, they met cunning resistance. Viriatus knew every ravine, every narrow trail where cavalry could not follow. When the invaders marched through valleys, his people vanished into the mountains, only to strike from behind. The shepherd became a strategist, his hills the perfect classroom. He was no aristocrat, no general born to command. Yet even among warriors, Viriatus stood apart, calm, calculating, and incorruptible. His fellow tribesmen saw in him a leader who fought not for plunder, but for dignity. Word spread of the shepherd who humiliated Roman columns with nothing but patience and terrain. In a world where loyalty was often bought, his could not be. The Romans, of course, labelled him a bandit. That was their favourite term for anyone who refused to kneel. But even some Roman officers began to murmur admiration, grudgingly perhaps, but sincerely. Viriatus fought like nature itself, silent, elusive, and merciless when cornered. By the time Rome realised the scale of their problem, the shepherd of the hills had become something larger than a man. He was a myth in the making, a ghost in the mountains, whose flocks had long since turned into armies. And Rome, for all its legions, had found its match in a man who once herded sheep. The Romans arrived in Lusitania believing conquest would be as easy as crushing an anthill. They came in armour that gleamed like the sun, carrying standards, banners, and arrogance in equal measure. To them, this land of rugged mountains and wild rivers was merely another line on a growing map. But to the locals, hunters, shepherds, and hillfolk, it was their motherland, and mothers aren't given up without a fight. At first, Viriatus wasn't a general. He was a survivor. When Rome's praetors demanded tributes and hostages, entire villages were enslaved or slaughtered. He barely escaped one such massacre, having witnessed his friends cut down and his kin taken away. That was the day he changed. The shepherd dropped his crook and picked up the sword. The man who once guarded sheep would now guard his people. Viriatus joined a small band of rebels who hid in the hills. Their weapons were mismatched. Rusty swords, hunting spears, even farm tools. But they had something Rome didn't: patience. Viriatus studied his enemy like a wolf studies a herd. He learned how their columns moved, how their scouts reported, how their discipline turned to chaos once the terrain worked against them. The first ambush came at dawn. Roman soldiers were marching through a narrow pass, tired and overconfident. Suddenly, stones rolled down the slopes, arrows whistled from the trees, and men screamed as the mountains came alive. The Romans fought bravely, but not wisely. They couldn't see their enemy, only shadows that struck and vanished. When it was over, hundreds of legionaries lay dead, and Viriatus had become a name whispered with awe and fear alike. Word spread fast. A new leader had risen in Lusitania, a man who fought like the wind and disappeared like smoke. Rome sent more troops, but every campaign ended the same way: ambush, retreat, humiliation. Even the Roman historians, who rarely praised barbarians, couldn't help but respect his brilliance. They called him a man of simple habits and great cunning. But Viriatus wasn't fighting for fame. His goal was freedom, a word the Romans used often, yet seldom granted. He knew they would come again, with more legions and more vengeance. And as the red banners reappeared on the horizon, Viriatus stood on the hilltop, eyes cold and calm. already planning the next move in a war of ghosts. By now, Rome had learned Viriatus's name and hated it. His guerrilla tactics were humiliating the mightiest army in the world. To them, he was a bandit, a pest. To his people, he was the wolf of Lusitania, the one who bit the eagle's claw and lived. Viriatus built his resistance not with grand speeches, but with quiet conviction. He knew every ridge and valley, every stream and shadow of the land. His army was a reflection of the terrain, fluid, unpredictable, untamable. While Roman generals depended on order and formations, Viriatus turned chaos into his weapon. His men travelled light, slept under the stars, and vanished before dawn. They fought in small bands, striking supply lines, ambushing scouts, and stealing weapons from the dead. He trained his warriors not to fight like Romans, but to fight against them. Never meet a wall head-on, he told them. Climb it, break it, or go around it. His soldiers became expert riders and trackers, using horn signals and smoke plumes to communicate across the hills. When Rome sent columns of heavy infantry into narrow ravines, Viriatus trapped them between fire and stone. He didn't win by numbers. He won by wit. The more the Romans tried to crush him, the stronger his legend grew. Villagers began offering him food, water, and shelter. Shepherds became spies. Even some Iberian tribes once hostile to Lusitania joined his cause. Rome had tried to conquer a province, but instead they had united it. One Roman commander, Servilianus, thought he could end it by sheer force. He brought 20,000 men and promised the Senate a quick victory. Instead, he found himself surrounded, his troops starved and desperate. When Servilianus finally surrendered, expecting slaughter, Viriatus did something that left even his enemies speechless. He spared them. He allowed the Romans to leave unharmed, under oath that they would respect Lusitania's independence. It was a move not of mercy, but of power. The shepherd-turned-warrior had forced Rome to negotiate, a humiliation recorded in their own annals. But peace with Rome was like peace with a viper. They slithered back to their camps, swearing vengeance. Viriatus had outsmarted them again, but deep down he knew this couldn't last. Wolves can outrun hunters for a time, but not forever. For a fleeting moment, peace seemed possible. The treaty Viriatus forced upon Servilianus was unprecedented. Rome had acknowledged a free Lusitania. The shepherd who once hid in the mountains was now the de facto ruler of a liberated people. His warriors hailed him as ducks, a title that would one day echo across empires. Songs were sung around campfires about the man who outwitted Rome's legions with nothing but courage and cunning. But Rome's memory is long, and her pride even longer. In the Senate, the news of a treaty with barbarians was met with outrage. The elders of Rome couldn't stomach the idea that their generals had bowed to a shepherd. Negotiating with rebels, one senator spat, is like feeding a wolf and hoping it turns into a dog. They ordered a new commander to Hispania, Fabius Maximus Servilianus's successor, Quintus Servilius Caepio, a man with the patience of a vulture and the ambition of a snake. His mission was simple: destroy Viriatus at any cost. Meanwhile, Viriatus ruled with humility. He didn't wear a crown or sit on a throne. He still rode his horse through the villages, greeting farmers, helping them rebuild what war had burned. He forbade looting and cruelty, insisting that they fight with honour. To him, freedom wasn't a slogan. It was sacred. Even Roman prisoners were often spared, a policy that earned him admiration from enemies and loyalty from friends. When Caepio arrived, he brought not just soldiers, but spies, informants, and silver. He knew that Viriatus could not be beaten by force. He had to be weakened from within. Slowly, Rome began spreading lies, rumours of disloyalty among Viriatus's allies, whispers of betrayal in the night. The new campaign was psychological. Rome offered gold and titles to those who would abandon the Lusitanian cause. Some chieftains began to waver, wondering how long they could fight a war that seemed endless. Viriatus, ever perceptive, sensed the shift. He held councils under torchlight, reminding his warriors of their purpose. "Rome fights for empire," he said. "We fight for home. But even heroes can't hold back exhaustion forever." The war had dragged on for nearly a decade. Fields lay barren, villages empty, and even the bravest hearts began to tremble. The wolf of Lusitania was still standing, but the hunters were closing in. The Romans, humbled but unbroken, changed their approach. They no longer sought grand battles. They sought bloodless victories. Gold, deceit, and diplomacy would now do what legions could not. Caepio, the new commander, was cunning where others were proud. He studied Viriatus as one might study a storm. Impossible to stop, but perhaps possible to redirect. He began courting the Lusitanian tribes one by one. Messengers whispered promises of Roman citizenship, fertile land, and eternal peace. For some chieftains, exhausted after years of mountain warfare, the sound of coin was sweeter than the call of duty. But for Viriatus, such treachery cut deeper than any blade. He had built his rebellion on loyalty, not plunder. Each defection was a fracture in his heart. Still, he fought on. His scouts ambushed Roman detachments, stole their supplies, and melted into the wilderness before counterattack. Yet, the victories grew smaller, the celebrations quieter. Food was scarce, horses were dying. The mountain wind carried not the songs of triumph, but the sighs of fatigue. Viriatus's wife, a fierce Lusitanian woman named Galducia, begged him to rest, to think of life beyond war. But he couldn't. "If I sleep," he told her, "Rome wakes." For him, the fight was no longer just for land. It was for dignity, for the right to exist without bending the knee. Caepio, sensing weakness, tightened the noose. His spies infiltrated Viriatus's circle, spreading doubt and greed. Among them were 3 trusted lieutenants, Audax, Ditalcus, and Menurus, men who had once sworn eternal loyalty. Caepio promised them what Viriatus never could, Roman gold and safe passage. When the next skirmish ended in victory for the Lusitanians, Viriatus called a feast. Wine flowed, torches flickered, and laughter returned for the first time in months. None knew it would be their last night together. As the camp slept, the 3 traitors slipped into his tent. Viriatus, exhausted, lay on his cot, his sword beside him. They knelt before him, as if seeking counsel, then drew their daggers. The first strike pierced his throat, the second silenced him forever. The man who had defied Rome for nearly a decade was gone, not by battle, but by betrayal. And as dawn broke over the hills of Lusitania, the wolf who had once howled against an empire lay still, his dream of freedom bleeding into the earth. Morning came cold and cruel. The Lusitanian camp stirred in uneasy silence. It was Galducia who found him first. Viriatus, her husband, their leader, the soul of their rebellion, lying still, his face peaceful, as if merely asleep. When the truth spread, disbelief turned to wailing. The wolf was dead, and with him, the heart of Lusitania broke. His killers, Audax, Ditalcus, and Menurus, hurried to the Roman camp, expecting applause, silver, and Roman citizenship. They were led before Caepio, smiling like jackals before a lion. "We have done your bidding," they said proudly. "Viriatus is no more." Caepio listened, nodded, and then turned to his guards. "Rome does not pay traitors," he said coldly. "Kill them." And so, the 3 men who sold their leader for gold died without reward, their bodies dumped into the dust. Treachery, it seemed, was useful, but never honourable. The Romans believed the rebellion would die with its leader. They were wrong. When Viriatus's warriors discovered how he had been betrayed, grief turned to rage. They lifted his body high on a shield, the way kings were honoured among warriors, and carried him to the mountains. There, under the open sky he loved,